I don't know where to begin, so I'll just start from the top. Right now, I'm 44, and I've been married to my wife, Clara, who's 41 for 10 years. We have an 8-year-old son, Alex, and by all accounts, we're a happy family. But this is not my first marriage. I was married once before, a long time ago, to a woman named Lena. We were childhood sweethearts, together since middle school, and we tied the knot after college as soon as we landed steady jobs. It seemed perfect, at least for a while. Lena and I had what I thought was a strong marriage for the first couple of years. But then, gradually, things started changing. It felt like she was drifting away, becoming distant and indifferent no matter how hard I tried to bridge the gap. I put in all the effort I could muster, planning dates, arranging weekend getaways, anything to rekindle the spark. But nothing worked. About 3 years into our marriage, Lena handed me divorce papers without any real explanation other than she wasn't in love anymore. I was devastated, and all I wanted was a reason, a solid reason, why we were ending what we had built together since we were kids. But Lena had none to give. I accepted it because I couldn't bear the idea of forcing her to stay with me, and dragging out a failed marriage seemed cruel to both of us. The divorce was straightforward, as we didn't share many assets, and once it was finalized, Lena vanished. I heard she'd moved to a different city and cut ties with everyone, including mutual friends. What made this unbearable was how my own family reacted, or didn't react. I expected their support. I was their son, after all, going through one of the toughest periods of my life. But instead of the comfort I desperately needed, I was met with silence. Around the time the divorce was finalized, my parents and my sister distanced themselves from me almost overnight. They ignored my calls, and when I tried to visit, no one answered the door. I was blocked on social media, and emails went unanswered. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The betrayal felt almost as bad as the divorce itself. For years after, I was in a fog of depression. I quit my job and spent months holed up at home, lost and rudderless. But thankfully, I wasn't entirely alone. My close friends stood by me, urging me to pick up the pieces and move forward. Without my family, these friends became my lifeline, encouraging me to follow my dream of opening my own restaurant. I'd always loved the idea of running a restaurant, but had put that dream on hold, partly because of the financial responsibility I shared with Lena. With the marriage now behind me, I decided to pursue that goal. I took the name suggestion my parents once casually mentioned for the restaurant, ironic considering how little they were involved in my life now, and started planning. With the help of friends and some determined investors, I built my business from the ground up. It took 4 long, exhausting years, but I opened my first restaurant and it was a success. 2 years later, I met Clara. We connected at a mutual friends party where she told me she was a fan of my restaurant. We clicked instantly. After 3 years of dating, I took a leap of faith and proposed. Now, a decade later, we have Alex, and life, at least on the surface, has been good. Not only has my personal life turned around, but professionally I've also managed to build an empire. That first restaurant was just the beginning. With hard work and the support of those around me, not my family, I grew my business into a chain of restaurants and hotels. Today I'm the CEO of a hospitality group that's expanding beyond the state. It was during an interview for a local news channel, sharing my story from struggle to success, that everything shifted once more. I had no idea the interview would reach my estranged family, or that it would inspire them to show up at my office out of the blue. The channel wasn't even that popular, so I never imagined my parents and sister would see it, let alone react to it. 3 days ago, while I was in the middle of work, my receptionist informed me that my family was waiting in the lobby. At first, I thought it was Clara and Alex, which would have been odd since Clara was at work and Alex was at school. But no, she clarified, it was my parents and sister. I felt my pulse quicken as the weight of 2 decades of silence suddenly loomed over me. I told my receptionist to ask them to leave and explained I was busy. But instead of going, they caused a scene. I couldn't risk the disturbance affecting my staff or customers, so I headed down to face them. There they were, almost unrecognizable, yet with the familiarity that struck a painful chord. They greeted me with broad smiles and platitudes about how proud they were of my success, as if they hadn't abandoned me without explanation years ago. They spoke as though we were a loving family, reminiscing and gushing over my achievements, even mentioning my wife and son, whom they'd never met. I tried to brush off their compliments, saying I was busy and needed to return to work. But when they brought up wanting to meet Clara and Alex, something snapped inside me. They blamed me for not reaching out more after the divorce, claiming I should have made more effort. It was then that I saw a chance to learn the truth behind their abandonment. I took a seat in the lobby, still struggling to comprehend the situation. My parents and sister sat across from me, visibly nervous. I forced myself to stay calm, though every part of me wanted to get up and leave. Finally, my father cleared his throat and started explaining. As the words came out, piece by piece, the reality of what had happened all those years ago began to unfold, and it felt like my world was shifting under my feet. Lena hadn't just fallen out of love with me, she'd been cheating on me, and not just with any random person. She was involved with my cousin Kyle. Kyle was the golden child of my uncle, my father's older brother. Spoiled since birth, Kyle was known for getting whatever he wanted, no matter who he hurt in the process. His mother had passed when he was an infant, and while that was tragic, it had led the family to treat him as if he were made of glass. Discipline didn't apply to him. If he messed up, it was swept under the rug. If he wanted something, he got it, no questions asked. The more my father spoke, the clearer it all became. Lena's sudden detachment, the strange behaviour leading up to the divorce, the abrupt silence from my family, all of it was connected. Kyle had decided he wanted Lena, and once he set his sights on something, no one in the family dared oppose him. My parents, under pressure from my uncle, had agreed to help cover up Lena's affair. It wasn't just loyalty to Kyle, it was fear. My uncle was not only the family's authority figure, but also my father's boss at the time. Crossing him meant risking not just strained relationships, but my father's livelihood. So they made their choice. Instead of supporting me, they sided with Lena and Kyle. The worst part? Lena had been pregnant when she handed me those divorce papers. And that baby, the child I never knew I had, was mine. My daughter, Emma, was now almost 20 years old. She had grown up believing Kyle was her father, never knowing anything different. I sat there stunned, my parents' words crashing down like waves, each one more devastating than the last. My mother added in a soft, guilty voice that they were forced into this silence because my uncle threatened to cut them off completely, not just from the business but from Emma as well. If they wanted any relationship with their grandchild, they had to stay silent and keep me out of the picture. It was like a bad dream, one where I had to pinch myself just to make sure I was awake. They thought this reasoning justified their betrayal. They genuinely believed that cutting me out was the lesser evil compared to losing everything else. My sister chimed in, her eyes glistening with tears, insisting that they had tried to protest but ultimately caved under my uncle's demands. But to me, it was all cowardice. They chose Kyle's comfort and my uncle's power over their own son. They let me spiral into depression and poverty without so much as a phone call. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. My cousin had stolen my wife and raised my daughter, and my own parents had helped him do it. It was surreal. Emma had grown up with them, unknowingly caught in this twisted lie. The sheer magnitude of it was suffocating. As my parents went on, I couldn't listen anymore. It was too much. The raw betrayal, the years lost, it all hurt too deeply. I stood up, cutting off my father mid-sentence. I told them I needed them to leave. They immediately started pleading, my mother's voice breaking as she begged me to understand how hard it had been for them too. They acted as though I could just shrug this off with enough explanations, as if the past 2 decades could be washed away by a few words and half-hearted apologies. I kept my tone as level as I could and told them they needed to go. This was my workplace, and I wasn't going to let their spectacle disrupt it any further. When they tried to push back, desperation clear in their eyes, I made it simple. I'd call security if they didn't leave. My sister, who'd been trying to justify their actions, looked at me with a mix of shock and defiance, as if I owed them this audience. This chance to come clean. Please, you have to understand. We only wanted what was best for Emma, she said, her voice sharp and defensive. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. best for Emma? What about what was best for me, their son, who had no idea he even had a daughter? What about the years I spent clawing my way back to some semblance of stability, thinking my own family had turned their backs on me for no reason? They kept insisting. My sister even claiming that my success was partly because of them, since they'd given me the restaurant name idea years ago. It was audacious, to say the least. As if suggesting a name equaled the blood, sweat and tears I'd put into building my life back from nothing. I couldn't hold back a dry chuckle at that and told them, point blank, that their contribution was laughable compared to what I'd endured and accomplished alone. They didn't stop arguing until I signalled the security guard standing by. The sight of the uniformed man seemed to jolt them into realising I wasn't bluffing. As they were escorted out, they kept glancing back, their faces mixtures of anger, regret and panic. For them, the stakes were suddenly clear. The son they discarded was no longer at their mercy. As they left, my father mouthed something, probably a final plea, but I didn't care to read his lips. It had been 2 decades, 2 whole decades of silence during which they had lived with their decision while I suffered for it. I watched them go, my chest tight and my heart racing, but I stood firm. If they could live without me for 20 years, they could do it again. It's been 3 days since that encounter. The apologises haven't stopped. They've bombarded my inbox and flooded my social media accounts with messages I refuse to answer. Every day I see them loitering outside my office building, their expressions weary and defeated, waiting for some sign of forgiveness. But I drive past without stopping. They made their choice, and now they have to live with it. 3 days turned into a week, and the attempts from my parents and sister didn't wane. Their messages became a steady stream of apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. Each time I scrolled past an email or an unread message, it reminded me of how hollow their words felt now. They said they were sorry and that they wanted to make things right, but I couldn't help but question their motives. Why now, after 2 decades of silence? Because they saw my name in lights? Because I had made it despite being discarded like an afterthought? Every night, Clara and I talked about what we should do next. She was trying to be supportive, balancing her own confusion and frustration with my emotional storm. We both agreed that my parents had forfeited their right to be part of my life the moment they abandoned me. But there was still one part of this entire mess that neither of us knew how to handle. Emma, my daughter. The thought of her weighed heavily on my mind. A presence that had been unknown to me for 20 years but now felt immediate and impossible to ignore. When my parents told me about Emma during that awful lobby confrontation, they'd given me just enough information to find her. Clara, always the voice of reason, suggested we wait and think it through before doing anything rash. I knew she was right. Emma was 20 now, an adult, with her own life and beliefs shaped by the lies she'd been fed. Showing up out of nowhere would likely throw her world into chaos, much like mine had been upended. Days passed in a blur, my mind wrestling with the decision. Should I reach out to her? How would I even start such a conversation? And what if she wanted nothing to do with me? After all, to her, I was just a stranger. But every day I waited felt like a missed opportunity, a failure to do what I could to connect with her before it was too late. I thought about Alex, my 8-year-old son, who had no idea he might have a half-sister. How would this change things for him? Finally, Clara and I decided that waiting wouldn't make the decision any easier. So, one evening I drafted a message. It was difficult to write. How do you tell someone you're their father after 2 decades of silence? I kept it simple, explaining who I was, the circumstances as I understood them, and that I would respect whatever decision she made about whether or not she wanted to know me. I sent it through social media, the only link I had to her, and then we waited. Days turned into a week. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped into my throat, only to sink when it was anything but her response. The anticipation was a strange mix of fear and hope. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a notification appeared. A message from Emma. Her response was brief, hesitant. She'd spoken to her mother, Lena, after receiving my message, and finally learned the truth, that Kyle wasn't her biological father. She was shaken, understandably so, and wrote that she needed time to process everything but wanted to meet me. I read her words over and over, scarcely believing it was real. I showed Clara, who nodded, her expression a mix of encouragement and apprehension. We decided it would be best for us to visit Emma rather than make her travel. She was a college student in another state and didn't have the means to come to us. Plus, it felt only right that we make the effort. We booked tickets and prepared ourselves for the trip, both of us wondering how this meeting would go. Alex didn't know why we were leaving, and we chose to keep it that way until we knew more. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was how anxious I felt. My hands trembled slightly as we stood outside the small cafe where we'd agreed to meet. I had pictured this moment in countless ways, how she might react, whether she would look like me or Lena, if she would be open or resentful. Every scenario raced through my mind until I felt a soft squeeze on my arm. Clara's reassuring smile brought me back to the present. Emma walked in a few minutes later. Seeing her in person was like being hit by a wave of emotions. She was tall, with Lena's deep brown eyes and my darker hair. For a moment, we just stood there, unsure of how to start. Then she smiled, small and tentative, and it was as if some of the tension in the room melted away. We sat and talked for hours. It was awkward at first, each word feeling heavy, but then it became easier. She told us how she had always felt a distance from Kyle, who raised her but never truly acted like a father. She shared stories of growing up, memories that I hadn't been a part of but now clung to as if they were mine. Clara listened quietly, only speaking when Emma asked questions about our family. My wife's calm presence helped anchor us, making the impossible conversation manageable. Emma admitted that she was hurt and confused, angry at Lena for lying and at Kyle for playing along, but she wasn't closing the door on me. She said she wanted to get to know us and, surprisingly, was excited to meet Alex. The idea that she might have a brother brought a brightness to her eyes that made my heart ache. As we said our goodbyes, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This meeting was only a beginning, a tentative step toward rebuilding something that had been stolen from us. But it was a start, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. Back at the hotel, I received another flurry of messages, not from Emma, but from my parents. Somehow word had reached them that I had connected with Emma, and now they were panicking. They begged me to set the record straight with my uncle, who had learned of the situation and was furious. My father was terrified of the fallout, even though he no longer worked for my uncle and had built a life independent of him. But the fear lingered, as deep-rooted as the loyalty they'd shown to Kyle at my expense. I couldn't find it in me to care. They had sacrificed me for their security and Kyle's whims. Now, the tables had turned, and they were the ones living in fear. Maybe it was petty, but it felt like justice. The days following our visit to Emma were a whirlwind of emotions and reflections. I couldn't stop replaying our conversation in my mind. The way she'd spoken, the questions she'd asked, the way she'd looked at me when she said she wanted to meet Alex. It was all so surreal, and yet it grounded me in a reality I hadn't dared to dream about before. Clara and I returned home with a cautious optimism, wondering what the future held now that the truth was out and the first steps had been taken. Alex remained oblivious for now, but I knew that would have to change soon. He had a sister, one who was eager to know him, and keeping that from him felt wrong. Clara and I spent hours discussing how to approach it, finally deciding to wait for the right moment, a moment that wouldn't overwhelm him but would allow him to understand. Meanwhile, my parents' persistence was relentless. Though they hadn't dared to show up at my office again, their messages were incessant. Each one carried the same thread of desperation, apologies mingled with justifications. My father pleaded with me to reach out to my uncle and explain that they hadn't betrayed him and that this was all my doing. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 20 years, they had prioritized their fear of my uncle over any sense of loyalty to me, and now they wanted me to rescue them from the very consequences they had spent decades avoiding. I ignored their pleas. The pain was still raw, too fresh to contemplate any kind of reconciliation. What could I even say to them that I understood? Because I didn't. I couldn't fathom the choice they'd made, how they'd stood by while their son lost everything, just to keep their standing with an overbearing relative and maintain a relationship with Emma in secret. Emma, however, was a different story. We kept in touch over calls and texts, gradually feeling out the boundaries of this new relationship. She had cut contact with Lena and Kyle, at least temporarily, needing space to process the truth on her own terms. I could only imagine the shock she must have felt confronting Lena, who had denied everything until she was cornered with no escape. Emma told me in one of our late-night conversations that Kyle's reaction was a mix of anger and confusion. He hadn't expected this truth to surface, especially not after 20 years. Despite everything, Emma seemed determined to move forward, not just with me but with Clara and Alex as well. She told me she wanted to visit us, to meet her half-brother in person and see what life was like on this side of the story. It was an idea that filled me with equal parts excitement and anxiety. How would Alex react? How would it change our family dynamics? Clara was a pillar of support throughout all of this, even when I knew it had to be difficult for her. It couldn't have been easy to watch me reconnect with a child I had with another woman, a child born of betrayal and lies, yet she never wavered, always reassuring me that we were doing the right thing. We were giving Emma and Alex a chance at something they both deserved, a sibling bond that had been stolen from them before they even knew it existed. We told Alex one quiet evening after dinner. We kept it simple, explaining that there was someone very special we wanted him to meet. His reaction was one of pure curiosity, wide-eyed and full of questions. He wanted to know all about Emma, and when we told him she was his older sister, his face lit up with excitement. The innocence of children sometimes has a way of making complicated things seem simple. Emma arrived the following weekend. The moment she stepped out of the car, I felt a lump in my throat. This time, it wasn't in a public place or a brief meeting. It was at our home, with my family, the family she was now becoming a part of. She hugged Clara first, a gesture that surprised and moved us both, then turned to me. The hug was hesitant at first, but it lingered long enough for the unspoken to be understood. This was the beginning of healing. Alex, with all the enthusiasm an 8-year-old could muster, ran up and introduced himself in his playful way. "Hi, I'm Alex, and you're my sister." He beamed and Emma laughed, a genuine relieved laugh that seemed to lighten the air around us. We spent the day showing her around, playing games, and just being together as a family for the first time. It was strange, but it felt right, like a missing piece had clicked into place. That night, after Alex had gone to bed, we sat around the living room with mugs of tea and talked more deeply. Emma opened up about her feelings and how difficult it had been to confront the reality that her entire life was built on a lie. She was torn between resentment for Lena and Kyle and a growing curiosity about the life she could have had. I listened, nodding and absorbing each word, resisting the urge to express my own anger toward them. This moment was about her, about understanding what she needed. Then Emma shared something that shook me to my core. My parents had always been present in her life, slipping her gifts on holidays, showing up for birthdays when Kyle allowed it. They never spoke about me, but they were there, subtly making sure she knew she was special to them. The realization stung. They had made this choice, to support her in secret while cutting me out. It was their way of appeasing their guilt, a compromise that left me bewildered and angry all over again. As we sat there, I understood that my parents' actions were rooted in fear, guilt, and selfishness. But knowing that didn't make it easier to forgive. Emma, on the other hand, was open to reconnecting with them, though she admitted it would take time. I couldn't blame her. They had been a part of her life, no matter how warped that relationship was. She had a bond with them that I couldn't fully grasp, and it wasn't my place to dictate how she navigated that. Clara reached out and held my hand, squeezing it in silent support. This was our reality now, a fractured past, a hesitant present, and an uncertain future. But amidst the wreckage, there was a seed of hope. Emma was here. She was choosing us. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start building something real. The weeks that followed Emma's visit were a mix of highs and lows, moments of warmth punctuated by the cold shadow of the past. It was strange how one revelation could change so much and still leave the world looking the same. Life moved on around us, but within the walls of our home, everything felt different. There was hope and excitement, especially with Alex growing more attached to his newfound sister. But there was also tension as I continued to ignore the messages and calls from my parents. Emma and Alex grew close in a way that only siblings could. They'd spend afternoons in the yard, Alex proudly showing Emma his favourite toys, or the two of them playing games on the living room floor while Clara and I watched from the couch. It was beautiful, this bond forming between them, a bond that should have been there all along but was finally making up for lost time. Emma's laughter had become a welcome sound in the house, reminding me of what we were fighting to build, a family that wasn't perfect but was real and ours. But the shadow of the past had a way of creeping in, no matter how much we tried to keep it at bay. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Clara and I sat on the porch, the cool night air swirling around us as we talked about everything. The question of my parents loomed between us. Clara, always the diplomat, felt that even if I wasn't ready to forgive them, maybe Emma would want some connection, especially since they'd been in her life more than I'd realised. "I know you're hurt," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "But Emma's experience with them isn't the same as yours. She might need to find her own peace with this." I nodded, staring out at the dark outline of the trees. "I know. I'm just not ready to be a part of that. They chose to walk away from me when I needed them most, Clara. I can't just erase that dot." She squeezed my hand, and we sat in silence for a while, the unspoken understanding stretching between us. It was true, I wasn't ready. Maybe one day, but not now. The next day, I told Emma that if she wanted to reach out to her grandparents, she had my support. Her eyes lit up with a mix of relief and determination. She didn't say much, just a quiet thank you. But it was enough to let me know that she needed this. A part of me felt a pang of jealousy, an echo of abandonment, but I pushed it down. This was about her, not me. A week later, Emma called and told me she'd reached out. My parents, predictably, had been eager to meet her, apologising profusely and showering her with remorse and explanations. She told me about their meeting, how they'd cried and confessed their regret over the choices they'd made, and the guilt they carried all these years. Emma listened to them, but she wasn't swayed easily. She had questions, and she made them confront the reality of what they'd done, not just to me, but to her as well. Hearing about their reunion stirred something in me. Part of me felt validated that they had to face what they'd done, but another part felt hollow, like a wound that hadn't quite healed was being poked. Emma said she didn't know where things would go from here, but that she wanted to maintain contact with them. I told her I understood, and I meant it. It was her choice to make, and I would support her, even if it hurt. Clara and I continued to navigate these new dynamics, careful not to let my parents' presence disrupt what we were building with Emma. For now, the boundaries were clear. Emma could reach out to them, but I wasn't ready to do the same. My parents respected that, or at least they stopped pushing for contact. The emails and messages slowed, turning into occasional updates instead of desperate pleas. I didn't respond, but I read them, each one chipping away at the wall of anger I'd built. Then one evening, Emma brought it up again. We were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea, when she looked at me with an expression that was both hopeful and hesitant. "Dad, I know this is complicated, and I'm not trying to rush you, but they really do seem sorry," she said softly. "They're not perfect, and I'm not saying what they did is okay, but maybe one day, if you feel ready, it wouldn't be the worst thing to talk to them." I met her gaze, feeling the weight of those words settle in my chest. Emma called me Dad now. It was new, and each time she said it, it felt like a balm, a reminder that the past didn't define what we could be to each other now. I took a deep breath, the kitchen clock ticking in the background like a heartbeat. "I don't know, Emma," I said, my voice hoarse, "but I'll think about it, Dot." And that was enough for her. She nodded, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We didn't need to say more. The path forward was uncertain, but it was there. The choice was mine to make when I was ready, and that was something I hadn't had in a long time. Weeks turned into months, and our new normal settled in. Emma visited often, spending time with Alex and growing closer to Clara and me. My parents stayed on the periphery, part of Emma's life, but not mine, at least not yet. They seemed to understand, staying quiet but present, like shadows waiting for the light. One evening, as I watched Emma and Alex playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air, I felt a shift within me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the smallest crack in the armor I'd worn for so long. Maybe one day when the time was right, I'd let it break open. Until then, I'd focus on what I had. This new, fragile family we were building. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and for now that was enough. Story 2. A friend of the daughter arrived, sobbing and carrying boxes. I understood everything with just one glance inside. Maya has been my daughter Tina's dearest friend since she was 9 years old. They were essentially hip attached. To be honest, I can't even recall a period of time when Maya wasn't there at our home. She would be there, as at ease as Tina, if you were to drop by on any given day. She had a key to our home, her own blanket on the couch, and her own place at the dinner table. A key, indeed. We treated Maya like family, so it's not something I do lightly. The notion that Maya was only a friend eventually faded. I had a second daughter more like. Every little moment was spent with her. Holidays, birthday celebrations, and even family get-togethers. Nor did she simply come to spend time with Tina. She would interact with every one of us. To be honest, I enjoyed her company just as much as my wife did. She was just one of those children who had a sense of identity. The room was filled with Maya's bright and large personality. She appeared truly happy to be a part of our life, constantly smiling and polite. Maya was the constant flame if Tina was our little spark. They would spend hours together playing games, watching movies, discussing school, or engaging in any other activity typical of adolescent girls. I appreciated the camaraderie they had. It felt like it would never end. Although Tina and Maya had quite distinct personalities, they were complementary to one another. Maya was the more practical one, the one who would help Tina think things through, whereas Tina is more of a dreamer and occasionally impetuous. Since I could see that my daughter occasionally lost herself in her thoughts, I had always assumed that Maya had a big impact on Tina. Maya was the buddy who would keep her sane by bringing her back to reality. Indeed, even when Tina wasn't around, Maya would occasionally visit the residence. She would be talking to my wife or spending time with my younger kid when I would walk in the door after work. I found it a little odd at first, but Maya blended in with all of us so effortlessly. While we all went about our nightly routine, she would sit at the kitchen counter and assist with supper or even work on her schoolwork. None of us ever questioned it, I believe. We simply agreed to it. What family wouldn't want a child like her around after all? It became evident throughout the years that Maya was more than simply Tina's buddy. We treated her as though she were a valued member of our family. She accompanied us on all of our family vacations, including reunions. I recall Maya and Tina playing a ridiculous game with my mum and my younger nieces and nephews at a reunion. Tina, quote, a second granddaughter, Maya, was called by her grandmother. It was that instinctive, as though she had always been a member of our family. We weren't the only ones who thought this. Don't get me wrong, Maya's parents were wonderful, but they were constantly occupied. They spent a lot of time away from home on business trips. They didn't seem to be as near to Maya as we were, based on what I could tell. They probably loved that she had a second family to fall back on. They would always thank us for caring for Maya so well and treating her like one of our own whenever I saw them. They were very appreciative, and I was glad to oblige. Now, if you know anything about me, it's that I don't use the word family carelessly. However, Maya, she deserved it. She was also present at some difficult periods. A few years ago, Maya was there to assist us throughout my wife's operation. She would bring over supper, assist with cleanup, and even watch the dog for a time. She did, even though she didn't have to. It's because she was concerned, and to us, it was everything. Then there were the small occasions that demonstrated their closeness. Tina had suffered from a severe case of the flu that kept her out of commission for days. In order to keep her company while she missed school and to check on her closest friend, Maya slept over for 2 nights. Maya was that sort of buddy. To be present for Tina and us, she would forgo her own plans and time. Perhaps, in hindsight, I took it all for granted. I simply thought friendship would be enduring, robust and powerful. As if nothing could ever stand in their way, Tina and Maya would discuss their future plans. They have aspirations of attending the same university and maybe relocating to the same city. They were bound to be in each other's lives forever. It quotes strange how things may get ingrained in you. Perhaps I also become too at ease. I don't believe I ever thought anything could separate them. From my perspective, Maya was family. And family is meant to remain together, isn't it? Here's the deal then. I failed to notice the fractures developing. In retrospect, though, I question if there were any subtle clues. I question whether there was anything further I could have observed or done. I believed that Tina and Maya would be the kind of lifelong friends you read about, that their friendship was unshakable. However, life tends to throw you curveballs, things that surprise you. You don't want to believe some things. Perhaps I would have acted differently if I had known what was about to happen. Perhaps I would have discussed loyalty and ideals with Tina. However, I had no way of knowing at the time that any of this would occur. We were therefore Maya's second family throughout those years. I trusted her, I had faith in her, and I had no reason not to. Through thick and thin, she had been there, a steady presence at all times. I never imagined that would be shaken. Maya began dating this man a few months ago. We'll refer to him as Jake. Initially, it appeared to be quite normal. She couldn't wait to tell Tina everything about him, all the minor things you may anticipate. I recall that Tina teased her about finally finding a man and appeared pleased for her. It was the typical best friend thing. Nobody gave it much thought. Now, I'm not the kind to make snap judgments or attempt to extrapolate too much from adolescent interactions. I was hesitant about Jake, though, for some reason. Perhaps it was because I had become so accustomed to Maya simply being as a member of our family. Abruptly, she was introducing someone else. Not exactly the right person. However, Maya was young, and I assumed she was simply going through that stage, so I tried not to worry too much about it. Getting caught up in your first serious relationship and wanting everyone to meet and like them is something we all do. Jake only visited once or twice at start. He made eye contact, shook my hand, and otherwise appeared kind enough. Indeed, he seemed sufficiently amiable. Yet, I sensed that something about him was strange. I'm not sure if it was because Jake felt like a closed book, and I was so accustomed to Maya being this gregarious, outgoing person. There wasn't much personality there, but he would respond to inquiries. I remained silent, though. I assumed I knew him too little to pass judgment. However, after a few weeks of dating, Jake began to visit more frequently. He spent so much time at our house that I would run into him in the living room or kitchen. And to tell the truth, I wasn't very excited. Despite the fact that I had no legitimate cause to be protective of Maya, I suppose I had a protective streak. It wasn't my business to interfere. She was a clever girl with good judgment. I still had the uneasy sensation that something wasn't right. And Jake wasn't the only one. It was about Tina, too. I saw a change in her, as if she had suddenly become hyper-aware whenever he was there. She would look in his direction far too frequently, and occasionally I would catch her looking as if she were deep in concentration. Well, perhaps she has a slight crush on him, I thought. They quote reteens after all. It's not the world's most startling revelation. Since he was Maya's boyfriend, she was most likely only interested in him. That's typical, isn't it? After dismissing it, these minor issues began to accumulate. Tina would almost hover over me while Jake was there, and I would be watching TV in the living room. She had never done this before, but at one point she even changed before going downstairs. Even if I wasn't yet prepared to draw conclusions. That's when I began to feel apprehensive. Tina, Jake, and Maya were all chatting and laughing in the backyard one evening. Something about Tina's gaze on Jake lingered with me as I peered out the window. It wasn't the expression of someone who was merely inquisitive. That's the expression teenagers get when they're in love. She had a smile on her face, but it was a little too big. Jake didn't appear to notice either, or perhaps he didn't give a damn. He continued to speak to Maya. His face was clueless. I had the impression that I was only a spectator seeing something that wasn't quite right. There was nothing tangible at this point, just a strange feeling. So, I didn't want to get involved. However, the atmosphere was so powerful that I began to monitor things more carefully. I mean, I had no idea Tina would do anything wrong. I had never seen anything from her that would lead me to believe differently. However, teenage emotions may be complex, and excellent people might surprise you with their actions. I began seeing small things after that night that would not have seemed like much on their own. Even if Tina had no need to be in the same room with Maya and Jake, she would find a way to be near them while they were at our house. She would simply be present. Additionally, I would see that she was paying a little too much attention to Jake's words, as if she was holding on to every single one. I'm her father, but it wasn't obvious or something that anybody else would notice. Perhaps I was simply paying a little more attention. Admittedly, that bothered me. My daughter falling for her best friend's boyfriend was something I didn't want to witness. You just don't cross that line. I couldn't exactly sit her down and tell her to stop gazing at Maya's guy, though. There was nothing wrong with her. Not technically, anyhow. I simply kept watching in the hopes that this crush would go away on its own. When Jake returned one evening, he and Maya were watching a movie together on the couch. I could tell Tina was more focused on Jake than whatever was on the TV since she was seated in the armchair. She continued to look at him as if she were attempting to understand him. It isn't good, I recall thinking. I began to debate whether or not to speak to her, perhaps simply take her aside and inform her that despite their seeming innocuousness, some limits aren't to be breached. But then it occurred to me that perhaps I was over-analysing this. Kids always develop crushes, and the majority of them are meaningless. They simply arrive and depart. Furthermore, they don't matter in the overall picture. Nevertheless, I couldn't get rid of the impression that this place was unique. Tina's feelings for Jake didn't seem to be fleeting, it seemed more deliberate, and I was concerned about it. In hindsight, perhaps I ought to have followed my instincts and spoken with her at that very moment. Perhaps it would have had an impact. But it's 20/20ths in hindsight. I also kept convincing myself at the time that it was simply a harmless crush. I assumed she would move on. Everything would return to normal after Jake's brief interruption. I decided to leave things alone. Tina knew better, I assured myself, and it was simply youthful curiosity. She had grown up with Maya as her best friend after all. She was familiar with the definition of loyalty. Whatever was going on in her mind, I thought she would never really allow it to go out of control. It's funny how your self-persuaded beliefs may occasionally be so far from reality. Therefore, Maya unexpectedly shows up at our place one day. It was tremendous, I must say. She slammed on the brakes as she came hurtling down the driveway, and before I knew it, she had reached the corner of our garage. I recall thinking, what in the world is happening? As I heard this huge explosion coming from inside. At first, I was completely unaware that it was Maya. I assumed someone had a rough day on the road after hearing this tremendous crash. She was standing next to her car, looking as like she had gone through hell and back, when I hurried outside. She had a pallid face, her eyes were crimson, as if she had been sobbing for hours, and her hands were shaking. She appeared to be struggling to keep herself together. But it was the automobile itself that really got to me. Upon closer inspection, I saw that the boxes crammed into the back seat were filled with Tina's belongings. Items from many years ago. Things I hadn't seen in a long time. I could sense this was serious, even though I didn't yet comprehend what was happening. Maya is the type of person that maintains her composure. I had never seen her like that before. She was a complete mess. She brought over boxes of Tina's old belongings and left them here as if she was finished, since whatever occurred, it was horrible enough. I approached her and said, "Maya, what's going on?" while attempting to speak in a composed manner. "Are you all right?" She only shook her head without saying anything, and for a moment I believed she may pass out there. I led her inside by taking her by the shoulders. She didn't fight back, did not speak up, simply following me. She was dragging herself with each step. Used up all of her remaining vitality. I poured her a cup of tea and set her down once we were in the kitchen. I was careful not to press her to speak. She clearly needed a minute. Her hands were still shaking as she sat there looking at the table without touching her tea. I continued looking at her, anticipating her next move. Anything. I was trying to think of what may have transpired between her and Tina the entire time. After so many years of being like sisters, Maya suddenly seems to have lost a piece of herself. She didn't glance up at me for a few minutes. "Did you know?" she questioned in a voice that was no more than a whisper. I just stared at her, perplexed, not knowing what she was talking about. She inhaled deeply before gradually revealing all to me. She had apparently discovered that Tina had been having affairs with Jake, her boyfriend, whom she had trusted. She informed me that she accidentally discovered Tina's voicemail on Jake's phone. My own daughter Tina didn't know Maya would hear the message she left for Jake. The mere sound of it sent a shiver down my spine. I could see how much it was costing Maya to tell me this, because her face was contorted with anguish as she did so. I was at a loss for words at that point. I couldn't even absorb it since I was so startled. My daughter Tina had been skulking about with the man Maya cared about, and I believed she knew better than to harm her best friend. I could only imagine how Maya was feeling, having to face this treachery from both her closest friend and her fiancé, as it felt like a strike to the belly. Maya was barely surviving, but she was doing her best to keep herself together. I attempted to soothe her by reaching out and placing my hand on hers, but I could tell she was broken. She informed me that she had been trying to figure out how this might have happened, and that she had discovered the previous day that she had been unable to sleep. Everything was far worse than I had ever anticipated, and everything was a catastrophe. I couldn't stop thinking about those times. Tina had been acting strangely around Jake, I'd observed. Every tiny clue that I had disregarded or dismissed as youthful infatuation. I felt guilty, like if I should have anticipated this and prevented it in some way. Maya continued by stating that she had attempted to discuss it with Jake and elicit an explanation from him, but he had little to offer. He had hardly shown regret, just advised her not to worry about it and dismissed it as an error. It was nearly as painful to hear that from him as it was to learn about the affair, Maya told me. He seemed to be unconcerned, didn't realize how much he had wounded her. As for Tina, well, she hadn't heard from Maya yet. She found it difficult to confront her. I could tell Maya had spoken everything she could by now. She appeared exhausted, as if she had lost all of her energy as she sat there. She hardly spoke after I helped her move the things from her car into our garage. I lingered in the garage and stared at those boxes after she drove away. Seeing all these small items that were Tina's and Maya's from their childhood seemed unreal. Antique toys, mementos and pictures. Little keepsakes they had accumulated over time. I recalled that on one of Tina's birthdays, Maya brought the teddy animal around. And now here it was, thrown into a box like if it were a useless object. Maya seemed to be attempting to delete all of their shared memories. To be honest, I couldn't hold her responsible. For a long time, I remained in that garage, unsure of how to react. Anger, disappointment, sadness, everything was there, entangled in a single large mess. I kept thinking about Maya's face and how heartbroken she appeared. She was losing more than just her boyfriend. Her dearest buddy was about to die, someone with whom she had grown up. Someone she had faith in, and being aware that the source of that suffering was my daughter. It was difficult to accept. My wife could sense a problem when I eventually returned to the house. However, I was unable to clarify at this time. It took me some time to process what I had just heard. I had to decide what I was going to say and how I was going to approach Tina. I was certain of one thing because of whatever had occurred. The situation would never be the same again. How I was going to face Tina was a mystery to me. The very thought of that made my mind spin around. How can you even mention such a thing? I reviewed everything Maya had told me all night long. Putting together the small details I had observed, but ignored the looks. Everything flashed back to Tina's behavior whenever Jake was there. Now it's as clear as day. Knowing that I had disregarded my intuition when it was virtually screaming at me made me feel nauseous. I knew it was time when Tina arrived home the next evening. She went in beaming as if nothing had gone wrong. There was a hefty pit in my stomach. I didn't want to think that my own kid might harm her closest friend in this way. I felt as though my two sides were at odds. The man who had just heard something he couldn't ignore, and the father who had always been proud of his child. She only gave me a perplexed, maybe anxious expression when I told her we needed to chat. I thought I was going to have one of those typical parent conversations about curfew or school when she sat down across from me in the kitchen, but this wasn't at all like that, so I simply told her. "Tina, tell me what's going on between you and Jake," I asked. She hesitated for a moment. There was a flash in her eyes and her grin dimmed, something akin to guilt or terror. It was swift, but I managed to catch it. She made an effort to act innocent and dismiss it. "Dad, what do you mean?" She inquired in a very informal way, as if she had no idea what I was talking about, but I wouldn't have it that way. I informed her that I had talked to Maya and that she had came over crying and told me what she had learned. I could see Tina's confidence ebbing as her face turned pale. I could see she was trying to piece together how much I knew as she avoided my gaze and glanced down at the table. "I didn't mean for that to happen," she said after a little pause. I recall my chest becoming constricted. She didn't dispute it. She made no attempt to protect herself. She seemed nearly dejected as she sat there. It seemed unbelievable to me. I had brought up my own daughter to be polite and courteous, yet she had betrayed her closest friend. And suddenly, without even disputing it, she was seated in front of me. "What did you do to Maya? Do you know?" Trying to speak steadily, I asked. I was reluctant to shout. I wanted her to realize how serious her actions were. She had faith in you. You two were like sisters. When she did glance up, her eyes were filled with tears. "Dad, I understand. I adore him, even though I know I made a mistake." I sensed my patience fading away as her voice broke on the final syllable. I was taken aback. "Love him. You believe that this is okay, Tina? You believe that hurting Maya in this way is justified by your declaration of love for him?" She gave me this frantic, begging look as if she thought I would somehow comprehend, but I was unable to do so. I didn't. This was not what I had planned, she muttered. As we approached, it occurred. I was unable to resist. I was so frustrated that I could hardly control myself. Resist. "You made a decision, Tina. You made the decision to continue texting him behind Maya's back each time you saw him. It wasn't a coincidence. I nearly felt sorry for her when she began to weep. Nearly. But then I remembered Maya, how she had supported Tina at every stage, how she had found me broken to pieces. Right now, I couldn't allow myself to feel sorry for Tina. So what? In an attempt to make her understand the ramifications of everything, I questioned her. "Will you simply remain with him? Continue behaving like you did? Not important." Tina's fists were clasped on the table as she gazed down once again. "I don't know," she eventually responded after wiping her eyes. "I simply feel that everything I achieved was in vain if I break up with him. Maya is already harmed by me. That can't be fixed now. However, if I leave him, I will have unnecessarily destroyed 2 relationships." Her remarks were like a blow to my head. She seemed to be acknowledging that she had done something awful, but yet attempting to explain it. What I was hearing was so unbelievable. "You're staying with him because you feel bad about it." I shook my head in question. "Is that how you're defending this?" She sat there in quiet without responding, and I felt a sense of disappointment come over me. I had anticipated that she would demonstrate genuine regret and an awareness of her actions, but instead she seemed to be attempting to rationalize them. As if it was somehow less wrong to stay with Jake. "You can't just go on as if nothing happened, Tina." "Maya was your best friend," I informed her. "Although you can't take back what you did, you could at least acknowledge your mistake and treat her with some decency. This entire situation is harsh and self-serving." She covered her face with her hands and began to cry more. However, I was unable to console her. I couldn't ignore this and pretend that everything would be well. I realized how far she had deviated from the person I believed her to be when I saw her in this state, and how she rationalized everything to herself. I eventually remarked, "You need to make things right with Maya," after a protracted quiet. "No matter how difficult or uncomfortable it is, I don't care. You should apologize to her. She deserves that much at the very least." Tina gave a feeble nod, as if understanding that I wouldn't let it go was the only reason she agreed. I was exhausted, let down, and genuinely devastated. This was not the child I had brought up. the daughter I had been proud of for so long. Although I was unsure of her identity at the moment, I was aware that I could no longer view her in the same manner. I told her, "I hope you think long and hard about this, Tina, because I don't know if Maya will ever forgive you," as I got to my feet, feeling a huge weight in my chest. To be honest, I'm not sure whether I can, either. She was sitting by herself in the kitchen when I left. I could feel the pain in my chest, and the stillness in the house was deafening. My own kid had changed into someone I didn't even recognize, and I never thought I'd be so disappointed in her. I kept thinking that perhaps I had missed something as I made my way upstairs. Something that may have prevented all of this. Now, however, it was too late for that. It had been several months after Tina and Maya's incident. However, nothing had quite returned to normal. Our entire family was still in shock after the incident, and to be honest, I was still finding it difficult to see Tina in the same light. I loved her, and she was my child. However, this circumstance hung over us like an ominous cloud. We were preparing for a large family vacation at the time. Months in advance, we had organised a trip to a beach resort where we could all rest, decompress, and simply spend time together. This vacation has been something I've been anticipating for a while. To ensure that the entire family could enjoy themselves. My wife and I had saved money, reserved a lovely location, and made all the necessary arrangements. I mean the entire family, excluding Tina's boyfriend Jake. I was aware that my choice would cause controversy, but I didn't care. I couldn't bear the thought of spending time with that man, pretending he hadn't contributed to the disintegration of our family. I generally wouldn't mind if my other children had brought their partners. However, this was not an ordinary circumstance. I didn't want to be reminded of all that had happened while I was on vacation by staring at Jake. Thus, I told Tina directly. She didn't invite her boyfriend. She gave me a look as if I had just informed her that we would not be celebrating Christmas. She seemed shocked at first, as if my words were unbelievable to her. Her face then gradually changed from one of amazement to one of rage. "What? Dad, are you serious?" Her voice was already trembling with annoyance as she asked, "Are you sure you won't allow him in?" "Yes, I'm serious," I said her, looking her in the eyes. "Tina, I don't want him there. Having him around isn't going to make this vacation peaceful, which is what I want." She looked at me as if she was waiting for me to give in, but I refused to back down. Even though I knew this would be a struggle and could see her aggravation mounting, I wasn't going to give in on this one. After what she did, I had already made enough concessions to allow her to work things out. However, I wasn't willing to jeopardize our family's opportunity to bond on this vacation in order to appease her. She responded, raising her voice. "You're punishing me. This is absurd. Dad, when are you going to pardon me? Months have passed. How long will you keep this hanging over my head?" I inhaled deeply while attempting to remain composed, but her remarks hurt. I informed her. "This is beyond punishment, Tina. Decisions are at play here. You choose to spend time with him. By refusing to invite him on this vacation, I'm making If you made a mistake and attempted to correct it, that would be one thing. You "re-still with him, though. That indicates to me that you have no remorse for what transpired." She was pacing back and forth, her hands balled into fists, and she was furious now. "It seems like you don't give a damn. But Dad, I do. All right, I made a mistake. I just can't quit seeing him, though. I can't act as though I don't care for him." I was filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "If you want to be with him, Tina, you can. However, don't count on me to embrace him. Our family is traveling, and I don't want him to go." I felt terrible when she started weeping, but I was unable to give in. "When will you stop doing this?" Her voice broke as she asked, "When will you stop acting like the villain toward me?" I gave a headshake. "I'm more worn out than ever. Tina, you made a decision that caused harm to many individuals, including Maya. And now, in spite of all that has transpired, you have decided to remain with him. I'm not suggesting you're a horrible person, but you need to realize that what you do has an impact. One of them is this." For a brief moment, I thought I was staring at a stranger as she gave me this angry, hurt face. This version of my daughter, this person who was only able to see her own emotions, was not someone I recognized. Everyone else, however, is allowed to bring their companions. Her voice grew more frantic as she protested, Why am I the only one who is unable to bring a companion? Because you did something that none of them did. I answered in a calm but forceful tone, Tina, you can't act as though this never happened. This is one of the repercussions of actions. I sat there feeling exhausted as she raced out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I detested the way our once intimate relationship had devolved into this tight, awkward muddle. I tried to forgive her and put this behind me, but every time I do, Maya's face comes to mind. That day, she arrived lost and damaged. I consider how my daughter caused such suffering, and it seemed as though a wall had been put up between us. To put it mildly, the days before the trip were stressful. The few times Tina did speak to me were brief and icy. She was clearly still hoping that I would alter my mind, but I had no intention of giving in. I couldn't cross this line, regardless of the pain. Tina was pouting and sat with her arms folded in the back of the car on the day we went. She stared out of the window. Tina sat there in quiet, seemingly lost in her own universe, while my other children spoke and talked excitedly about the vacation. A part of me wanted to say something to try to make things better, but I knew that nothing I said would make her feel any differently. To be honest, I could understand why she was upset, but just because she didn't agree with my choice didn't mean I was going to let her walk all over me. Upon arriving at the resort, Tina remained alone for the most of our journey, only joining us for meals and the odd family outing. She would arrive, pretend to smile politely, and then revert to her aloof, icy demeanor. Even though it was painful to see her in that state and to realize how badly our relationship had been ruined, I believed that I had made the correct decision. I didn't want this trip to be ruined for everyone by one poor choice. Although the trip was enjoyable in the end, the strain was always present. I sensed it every time I glanced at Tina. This unsaid annoyance between us. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would understand why I had done what I had done, even though I knew that things wouldn't return to normal anytime soon. I had no intention of punishing her, in order to demonstrate to her that decisions have repercussions, even if they are difficult. I was attempting to establish boundaries. The tension between Tina and I persisted after the holiday. It simply got worse. The few times she talked to me were brief and almost icy. In an attempt to mediate the situation, my wife eventually sat me down and advised me to speak with her. This cannot continue. I was aware of her correctness. I thus waited until Tina arrived home the following day and asked if we could speak. Despite her irritated appearance, she sat down with her arms crossed, obviously prepared to defend herself. Look, I began. Tina, I don't want things to continue this way. I detest feeling as though there is a great wall between us, even though you are my daughter. She rolled her eyes and sneered. Dad, you constructed that wall. You behave as though I'm the only person who harbors resentment. However, you continue to punish me. Even though her remarks hurt, I spoke in a calm voice. This has nothing to do with punishment. Someone was harmed by you. You remained with him as if it didn't matter that you were close to and trusted by him. I find it difficult to ignore it. Clearly upset, she averted her gaze. I care for him, Dad. Even though I realize I made a mistake. I quote, "I'm not here to harm Maya with him. I genuinely like him, which is why I'm with him." I inhaled deeply. I understand. However, you must realize that in my opinion, you picked him above a long-standing friendship. You can't act as though this never happened. After hesitating, Tina spoke. After that, I attempted to contact Maya. She doesn't want to interact with me, and that's her right, isn't it? I attempted to apologize. However, it is painful. Jake as well. The only thing that slightly lessens the pain is him. It confused me to hear her say that. She had always seemed selfish to me for remaining with Jake, but perhaps there was more to it than that. Perhaps all she was doing was clinging to something that might help her deal with the aftermath. It helped me better comprehend her point of view, but it didn't make it acceptable. I understand that you have also found this difficult. Finally, I said. However, you must acknowledge that Maya might never forgive you. I need to feel like you're learning from this, but I still want to be there for you." Her gaze softened somewhat as she nodded softly. Dot. It was a beginning, but not a solution. I thought we would really be able to get out of this situation for the first time in months. She murmured softly, "Thanks, Dad," and went upstairs. Even though it was a tiny gesture, it offered me some hope. If she was, I was willing to try, but we still had a long way to go. Things were finally beginning to feel a little more normal a few weeks following our conversation. We weren't suddenly reunited, and Tina wasn't her former self, but at least we were communicating. I could tell that both her and I were trying. We both seemed to have come to terms with the fact that meaningful progress takes time. Then one evening she returned home in utter disarray. She had been sobbing, and I could tell. She seemed dejected, with smeared makeup and red eyes. She never even reached her room. As if attempting to keep herself together, she sat down at the kitchen table and just gazed at the wall. I knew the answer, but I still asked whether she was okay. There was a lengthy pause before she muttered, "Jake betrayed me." She seemed dejected, ashamed and upset, as if she needed to get it off her chest but didn't want to say it out. I was more affected by hearing that than I anticipated. I was upset for her. I'm disappointed and, to be honest, a little stunned. That was all I could think. He did, of course. Nothing seemed just right, but I wanted to say something reassuring. Her voice was unsteady as she began to speak. I suppose I disregarded the strange behavior he had been displaying for some time. I believed that he may simply be under stress. But he made a mistake today. He has been seeing someone else, I discovered. She came to a halt, and I could see how it affected her. All along, he has been deceiving me. I believe she could see it in my face. Even if I didn't say "I told you so," I simply placed a touch on her shoulder instead. I truly apologized, Tina, and I meant it. In my own way, I was aware of that. She was very affected by this and she cared for him. Tina wiped her tears and shook her head. Perhaps. I could have earned it. As if finding it hard to accept what she was saying, she muttered, "That didn't sit well with me. She had made errors, to be sure, but no one should have to endure this. I told you you didn't deserve this, Tina. You will develop from the difficult lessons you learn, but don't believe that you caused this. His actions reveal more about him than they do about you." She nodded, appearing somewhat calmer. Although that wasn't an easy lesson, she could have needed it.